5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hello, space enthusiasts. Welcome to another episode of the Space Business Podcast, where we investigate all the exciting ways in which people participate in the new space economy by conversations with entrepreneurs, executives, investors, and other members of the space family. My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor in and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by NanoAvionics, a satellite bus manufacturer and mission integrator. Their satellite technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation for various purposes, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University, or ISU, which is also our partner in this podcast. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide, ranging from executive courses lasting a few days all the way to a one-year master's. Check them out at isunet.edu. Did you know you can use satellite imagery to make agriculture more efficient and hence help feed the world? You bet, space can do that too. My guest on this episode is Max Gulde, CEO and co-founder of German startup ConstellR, and he will explain how their infrared remote sensing satellite constellation does that. Please enjoy my conversation with Max. Hey everybody, today I'm joined by Max Gulde from ConstellR. Welcome Max, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Raphael? Very nice having me. Thanks.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And actually, I was just welcoming you, and then I realized I'm actually not sure whether is it ConstellR or Constellar, or how do you pronounce it?
Whatever you like it to be, but it's Constellar. That's at least what we say.
Constellar. Okay, now we know. Perfect. So why don't you start off as always and give us the 2-minute or 1 minute, if you want, elevator pitch on ConstellR.
Okay, so what Constellar does in a nutshell is that we would like to provide precise and global temperature data for a growing planet. So by means of a microsatellite constellation, we will map and monitor the infrared spectrum, so the temperature of our planet's surface. And this is incredibly important to enable smart farming on a global planetary scale. So basically, by looking at temperature, you can directly assess the water need and other stress factors for plants. And this enables you to drastically reduce the amount of resources you need in order to obtain the same or even more crop yield. And the reason we're doing this is because we see a trend in rise of demand for food at the one hand. On the other hand, we have climate change and we have a dwindling of resource. And to match this impending food gap and basically prevent a global agriculture breakdown, we need to change something. And that's what Constellar is doing.
Okay, and can you go a little bit more into detail on this, what you call smart farming? Is that the same as precision farming? And is that something that people are already doing right now in some other way? Or is that like a relatively recent development?
So I'll tell you how we understand it. Precision farming basically means that you don't treat fields as a whole anymore, but you treat them localized. So you try to assess what part of the field or part of the plot would need what resources to best grow. And then you apply it localized. And obviously, if you have geolocalized data, this can help you. So when we're talking about smart farming, it's not so much about the execution of then having your tractor or having your instrument going over your field and applying, but it's about gathering this information and making a smart decision on where to put what. So we would be targeting smart farming companies which are operating in the precision farming market. But smart farming, precision farming, I would claim it's not the same, but it's basically under the hood of agriculture 4.0. And what we are doing very differently is that imagine the scale. If we talk about global food security, we're talking about a global scale. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but we have around 1.5 billion hectares of global agriculture land. So how do you make smart decisions on that scale? There are obviously a lot of difficult decisions to be made and a lot of interesting approaches to take. And the most common approaches are that you're flying drones over your fields or you're installing in situ sensors on your field. But to be globally scalable, you need something which is also operating on the global scale. And their satellites are the ideal tool. So why are we not using the infrared spectrum so far? And what's the advantage of the infrared spectrum for smart farming compared to what's out there? So basically in 1973, I think it was the Americans, they figured out it is a very good idea to basically check out some competitors, countries, and you can imagine who that could have been, wheat yield and crop yield, to understand if there might be a potential for tension from, let's say, a suffering food supply. And what they developed is a methodology how you can, using optical, visual and near-infrared images, to get an idea of the crop health and get an idea of the yield. And this was the first time spaceborne instruments were used to get a yield estimation and to try to correlate, in this case, its physiology, so leaf color, with yield. What we are doing differently here is basically the same technology, so it's nearly 50 years old, is still used today. Obviously, we have high resolution spatially as well as temporally. So our Planet Labs is looking at basically the whole globe, assuming there were no clouds, at least once a day. And this is still the status quo of what we're doing. So we're trying to derive what the plant needs from the color of the leaf. And if the plant starts to wither or the leaf color is changing, then we change something. The problem is that this process is hellishly slow. It can take days to weeks until these physiological changes do manifest in the end. If you would look at the temperature instead, what you're looking is at, let's say, the thermal signature of the plant, and you look at its transpiration instead. For example, if there's a lack of water, the plant can't transpire any water anymore. So the gating cells, the stomata on the lower side of the leaves, are closing, and you immediately see a change in the temperature signature. And depending on what type of cause you have, it could be a fungus which is sitting on there, it could be a lack of nutrition, it could be a lack of water, you get a different signature and you get it immediately. So by looking in the thermal infrared on these plants, you have an immediate and very robust way of assessing what the plant really needs, and not only assessing it once it's too late. So 2 weeks after, I should have watered the plant, but basically knowing it now.
And so it's basically a correlation between temperature and sort of water content, and hence the plant's needs for irrigation.
In a way. So what the variable you're after is so-called evapotranspiration, and that's now we're getting very technical. Evapotranspiration is the loss of water to the atmosphere. So it's the mix between evaporation and transpiration. Transpiration is what the plants are, and also animals and us. So if you go for a run, then you'll transpire, and you're losing water to the atmosphere. And on the other hand, it's what the soil is losing, and that's evaporation. And if you combine those two, you have evapotranspiration, and this is most robustly derived from temperature. But currently, there's no temperature data available which is comparable and is on the, let's say, relevant spatial and temporal scales and globally affordable.
I'm not a farmer, and I'm not even anywhere close to being an expert on plants. I'm just
neither am I a farmer.
We're going to talk about that in a second, Max, which is basically how you came up with that idea. But no, I wanted to ask: isn't there going to be differences by plants? I'm sort of like thinking like rice is going to be different from, I don't know, like a cactus or something. I don't know.
Exactly. No, it is very different, and that's about the differentiation I do between plants. Either it has spikes, that must be a cactus. If it's small, it's some plant. If it's large, it must be a tree. So, but yes, depending on what kind of plant you have, yes, obviously there are very large differences. It depends on the size of the, let's say the canopy coverage. It depends on very many different variables, and even depends on humidity, on wind speed, and other things. For that reason, we're not going to provide the full agriculture service, because there are companies which can do this a lot better than we can. But what we are doing is we're providing the foundation data for those companies to make their products a lot better. It does take a lot of research. Luckily, since we have thermal data since nearly as long as we have optical data, we also have a very mature research body on how to then derive this and how to translate these data then into insights for the farmers. And I'm pretty confident that there's enough knowledge out there to actually do this. And we're having first pilots and trials to see how effective it actually is.
Okay, so the question I want to come back to after you have just told us that basically you classify plants into plants with and without spikes.
I should have not said that, yeah.
Don't worry, it's only going to be thousands of people who heard this. So I wanted to ask is how did you come up with this? How did you come up with the idea to basically start a company that's using satellite-based infrared to help smart farming? And where's that coming from?
Yeah, so initially we didn't want to start a company. The company was actually, maybe that's not smart to say, but it was actually fake. It was just to make our proposal more attractive. So, but let's go back to 2017. First of all, I'm a physicist. I'm not a space engineer, aerospace engineer, anything. I applied at the position of mission scientist at the Fraunhofer Institute in at one of the Fraunhofer Institutes in Freiburg. I'm still a bit curious why they took me as a mission scientist, whereas I was clearly not really qualified for that position, but they nevertheless did, and it was good for me. So then I dived into all kinds of space topics, always with the perspective of a physicist who actually did microscopy. So I was moving with very high speed from the microscopic scale to the macroscopic scale. At some point, we came across a challenge. It was a Copernicus Masters challenge, and it was from ESA, and they basically said, design us the best and most impactful mission for below 1 million euro. And if you do so, well, first of all, you get the 1 million euro. And secondly, you get a free launch. We had no idea what this mission could be. So we sat together and said, okay, what are the most pressing issues? And we sat together with colleagues from OHB, for example, and others. And we're trying to figure out what could be this mission. So we were burning for this challenge. It was super fun, having basically no idea about entering this challenge. Mm-hmm. Then we came up with, okay, what's really missing in the spectrum and would be really useful for food security, and a lot of other topics too, urban heat islands, forest fires, fire risk estimation, coal fires. And we identified more than 30 use cases, not at this first day, but then during the time. And we started writing a proposal. While we wrote the proposal, we apparently solved a couple of problems which are not solved in terms of thermal infrared imaging at this point. So in order to increase our chances to win, we even claimed we'd found a company, which we clearly had no intention to do. Because why would you found a company if it was so comfortable being within Fraunhofer and just doing your research? Mm-hmm. We were then pretty surprised when ESA called us and said we were amongst the 3 finalists. So we didn't win in the end. We didn't win the million. We didn't win the free launch, but we are triggered. We then entered an accelerator program, still not taking this very seriously in terms of company founding. What then happened is that I got really, really frustrated because this fantastic idea was simply not resonating neither with the government nor with other funding institutions. And they all said, yes, call us when you have done it, but not before. And nobody was willing to invest in pilots, in technology development, all these things which need to be done. And then the only way which was left open was actually founding a company. We went into a Fraunhofer accelerator and we said, okay, this is an accelerator specifically for scientists, actually specifically for risk-averse scientists from Fraunhofer, as we were. We said, okay, let's take this 13 weeks time, let's really assess it carefully, and let's see if there is the slim chance that actually founding a company might be a good idea, which we didn't believe at the time. And it was about 30 minutes into the first session of this accelerator, they were all shouting, let's found the company, let's found a company. And since then, we've been pretty successful with Constellar.
And so you're saying it wasn't resonating with a bunch of stakeholders. Well, of course, the most important question is it resonating with the customers? And so how has that process been of customer discovery? And I guess the first question there would be just to check, who are exactly your customers? Is it actually the farmers, or you mentioned there's also like a sort of smart farming expert companies in between?
It's definitely not the farmers. So the farmers, they will benefit from it. But as you might know, the agriculture sector is rather fragmented. So going from farmer to farmer and explaining what temperature data can do for him or her would not be the way to go. With the Sentinels, so for nearly a decade now, there's more and more data available. Yeah, there are more and more companies sprouting, which are becoming experts and already are experts in how to use Earth observation data, remote sensing data, for the good of agriculture and many other things too. This is an ideal launchpad for such data. So what we would basically do is complementing this data set, giving this data set to companies which are already providing insights to the farmer. Maybe rolling it up from the other side is, let's say you have a farmer, Hans, obviously a German farmer, I would guess, and Hans is looking at his fields. And let's say there's 10 hectares or 100 hectares or how much fields Hans has. If he wants to use precision farming, let's say he just bought a nice tractor from John Deere or Claas or something, and he would really like to go into precision farming because he believes and he sees from his colleagues that's actually having a positive impact. So he's not going to do all this data crunching, number crunching by himself, but he's going to companies which are offering services. So he's basically in a web browser marking his fields and saying, those are my fields. I would like to have advice. What's the nitrogen content of these plants? What is the water stress of these plants? And so on and so forth. And then they deliver him day by day, for example, irrigation advice. They tell you, okay, Hans, tomorrow is going to be a dry day. So try to, and there's a lot of this and that. So try to irrigate in the morning and this and that amount, and be aware that in this part of the field, there's a fungus outbreak, which shows from this and that signature. Okay, so Hans is doing this. And these companies, they rely on data from all kinds of types of data initially, but more and more on satellite data. Actually, the market is growing and also the number of companies growing, and about 20% per year. So there's amazing market growth. And those companies are our target customers. So we are selling new and better data currently not available to those companies to really, let's say, boost their products.
Okay, you just relieved my fears here. I thought you were literally going to Hans and telling me, hey, Hans, I've got like data from space and you have to become a data scientist, which probably wouldn't work so well. So when you go to these, let's call them intermediaries for the lack of a better word.
We call them VASPs, or value-added service providers.
That sounds much better than intermediaries, value-added service providers. Sort of like, what is the business model with them? Like, for example, do they pay by like sort of per acre, or how does that work?
Yes, that's pretty much it. So if you look at the Earth observation sector, I think the business models are partially still stuck somewhere in the 90s. But the most common one is that you're basically paying per area you're using, and then you're basically paying per image. We're currently trying out different things, subscription models that you basically just pay per time and area. But it might turn out that these models, and we know some companies which try to establish these models before us, and they were not super successful. It might be that those models are not working as well as the classical one. We're basically saying, okay, you want to have data for, 2 square kilometers, then you pay for 2 square kilometers. You want to have this data 10 times over the next, let's say, 2 months, then you pay 10 times the amount. Well, you basically buy 100 square kilometers, and then every time you basically look at something, it's going to be deducted from this kind of credit.
You brought up a point I wanted to ask about anyway. So with sort of 10 times per month, for example, I mean, how often does it make sense for smart farming? How often should farmers look at it? And then, so that's what we, I guess, call temporal resolution. And then the other question would be on the spatial resolution that makes sense for this use case.
This, again, very much depends on what you're looking at and where you are. So first of all, we have to differentiate between when are you actually getting data, and that's not the same as when the satellites are flying out, because it might be cloudy. So let's assume we have in general 50% cloud coverage over mid-Europe. Then the threshold is somewhere between 2 and 3 days that you need data, maybe 2 and 4 days, every 2 to 4 days. And that's really needing insights. So the models are good enough to cope with not having data or using other data in between those intervals. And then if you have the 50% cloud coverage, this translates to, okay, I need actually every 1 to 2 days, I need an overfly, an overpass. If you're going to the equatorial regions, obviously that you have 80 or 90% cloud coverage. So you have to be there in the morning, and you need relatively high revisit times. So that means even if you have daily revisit time at the equator, you might only get one, let's say, useful image a week. And that's the absolute threshold of being able to use that. So that's about the temporal resolution. In terms of spatial resolution, again, there are some things which are more homogeneous. So if you're looking at corn or maize or wheat, which do not necessarily require very high spatial resolution compared to, for example, if you have an orchard, or if you're looking at wine and grapes. So there's a pretty good study from Tobias Hank and Heike Bach, what the spatial resolution for LST, or land surface temperature monitoring, should be. And basically, for some of the things, you need 10 meter. That's something we cannot do. So we would be at 50 meters. But for most of the things, somewhere between 50 and 100 meters would be okay. However, it again very much depends where you are. If you are in Bavaria, or if you are in somewhere in Germany, where the average field size is a bit more than a hectare, then you only get a very small amount of pixels and data points basically for your field, especially if it's not necessarily a rectangular or square-shaped field. If you are in the US or in Australia, or if you at some places where the fields are large on average, then obviously your resolution can be a lot more coarse. And if in Africa, then the average field size is tiny, and then maybe 10 meters would even be too coarse.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the same sort of comparison, sort of the Hans farm in Germany versus the other place I know agriculture well is in Brazil. And like Brazil, you have some monoculture farms which are like bigger than some small countries. Yes. So, which I guess is another interesting question. Is there any sort of use case in terms of like crop and or in terms of geography that kind of makes sense to do first, or do you just leave that up to your value-added resellers?
Yeah. Maybe we should approach this from the other angle. Where is it needed the most? And that's the angle we are coming from. Obviously, we need to make money, and that's clear. But also the question is, where is the impact the largest? We are talking a lot to companies which are in Europe, but which are actually looking at fields which are not in Europe, which are done in Sub-Saharan Africa and South America or India. This should be where the focus lies, because by 2050, about 60% of all global food will be produced in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. So I'm very keen on looking at those use cases first. That's the nice thing about data. Once you have recorded data over a certain area, and then if I record something in Africa, it doesn't hinder me to record more data in Europe. So there's no competition in that sense. Then we'll simply see whether customers would like to have their data recorded, but ideally it is in those regions which need it most.
And this sort of needing the most, and then the next step, sort of like where you can have the most benefits. What are the metrics you use? So if it's about, again, it seems to be basically about irrigation. I guess you could measure that by, liters of water saved per acre, or you could measure it by like you use the same amount of water, but does it maybe increase the crop yield by X%? Is there any particular way you look at it?
The crop yield seems to be the logic way and the intuitive way to do it. However, this is very hard, because crop yield strongly depends on, simply the year. Maybe sometimes you have a good year, sometimes you don't have a good year. Sometimes there's more rain, less rain. So crop yield is not very constant, at least not on the small scale. The metric we're looking at is actually the saved water. And they're indicators that, for example, if you would use, let's start again with the visual near-infrared data. So we talk to companies which are using near-infrared, sometimes even shortwave infrared data, and they can usually save up to 10% of the water. So usually you need about to 5,500 tons of water per year per hectare. So it's quite a bit of water. It's a European average, actually a Southern European average. There might be areas where it's a bit larger. If you're in Norway, or if I grew up in Schleswig-Holstein and in Germany, that you probably need a lot less. Actually, sometimes you need to pump water from the fields. In this case, what you would do is, if you would temperature data, you can save up to 40% of the water without losing any crop. Even so, there are studies depending again on the crop. You can gain 5 to 18% of crop yield just by watering correctly and giving the plant less stress. Not yet accounting for that you get this information earlier, so the plant might not even feel a lot of stress. Because you get the information before the plants are withering or the leaf colors change. And if you do a little, so we have done little impact studies. Obviously, those are very simple, simple yet. But if you would assume that you can apply temperature-based, doesn't have to be our data, but this temperature-based water need assessment on about 30% of globally irrigated fields, so not the non-irrigated fields, just those which are already irrigated, you save enough water to increase crop yield by 7% globally if you reapply this water to the field next door, which is not irrigated. Obviously, there's a transition process, just to give you the idea of the potential. So 7% of crop yield more would mean that you can sustainably feed, without more resources, nearly 600 million people. If you now say, okay, that's interesting, and if you now imagine that African farmers or European farmers, whoever, actually have benefit from using less resources and increasing the yield on the other hand, you can then make an assumption about the benefit, and it's somewhere in the region of $150 billion per year. So that's the power of infrared featured smart irrigation.
These numbers you've mentioned now, whether it's on the water savings or the crop yield increase, is it sort of, let's say, models, or have there actually been sort of controlled studies of the kind you mentioned? There's like you have a field of Hans on one side who's using temperature data, and Fritz next to Hans, and he doesn't use infrared data.
So this is our model for the maximum potential days. So this is not based on a study, but obviously the individual numbers are based on studies. So how much water can you save if you use temperature indicators on the field? The difficulty here is that the data we are looking at simply, or we would like to provide, simply doesn't exist yet. And that's the difficulty. So you have to find alternative ways to record this data, of which you believe which are at least equally well equipped to do the job. So there's still a bit of uncertainty in there. I mean, we're working on different pilots. Hopefully, by the end of the year, I could answer this question with let's say, more substance.
So this is an interesting question. So I understand, obviously, that your own constellation is not up there, and hence this data doesn't exist. But is there maybe, have there been studies using? I think there's some infrared satellites, obviously, up there, like Landsat and so forth. Or I guess you could put these types of sensors on other platforms like drones or aircraft, or maybe even towers. I don't know. Like, have there been studies using these other platforms or the other satellites which exist? So
there are tons of studies with Landsat and even Meteosat. The problem is that with existing platforms, let's take Landsat 8. Landsat 8, I think, is one of the most used thermal infrared sensors because it has a 100-meter resolution, but it only comes by every 16 days. So if you account for 50% cloud coverage, this means that under normal conditions, you would get 1 image a day. And this is way too long to actually to react timely on any change. So for that reason, those platforms, as far as we are concerned and we know from our customers, are not used. They would love to use it, but it's simply not useful. They're not fit for purpose. It doesn't mean that it's a bad sensor. It's a fantastic sensor, but they're simply not fit for purpose in terms of agriculture. So what people are using is Sentinel-3 and MODIS, which come at 1 square kilometer resolution. And obviously, you can imagine there's a whole lot happening within 1 square kilometer.
Sure.
So it's not going to be a homogeneous way to do this. There have been studies with airplanes. There have been studies with drones. However, most of the drone studies are not using thermal infrared, but using similar sensors because they're more cheap, lighter, and let's say less technically difficult than the thermal infrared, which are also invisible in near infrared. There are studies with cameras which are positioned stably and fixed in some position on some tower. But the easiest way to do it is basically getting the temperature from the plant by sticking something like a thermometer next to the plant and then applying water depending on what the thermometer says. So kind of an IoT solution, which is difficult to scale globally, but which gives you a very easy and good idea of what it could be.
Oh, that's funny. In that way, you could end up competing, I guess, with the sort of like satellite IoT providers.
Yeah, in a way, this could be competition. I think, however, that if you imagine now Hans, let's say, is maybe still a bit skeptical. So there's a certain resistance to momentum, I guess, in the agriculture sector, which is completely understandable because your livelihood depends on it if you do the right decision or not. Let's say Hans thinks about, do I really want to use this IoT sensor in my field? And he thinks about things like, well, it's at some point it's going to get in the way of harvest, so I need to remove it again at some point. What's the initial cost? And then he thinks, okay, a couple of €1,000 to build it up. So I will probably not to put it on every single field. So I don't put 3 per hectare, but I probably put one of these weather stations for 10 hectares just to get an idea. He has to buy the software, or there are licensing fees and all these things. So there's a huge upfront cost and actually a huge financial risk for Hans. If we had the opportunity, and that's what we see, and companies which are doing this are growing massively, if you can remove the upfront cost and any maintenance or anything any hardware in the field, and suddenly Hans says, look, something like 30 or 50 euro per month or even per year per hectare, I can really look at my fields, and that's not a big risk I'm taking. And if I see after one year that it's a good deal, then I keep it. And otherwise, well, I might have lost a few hundred euros, but not a few thousand euros, and that's something I'm going for. So I think also the kind of threshold until when from when farmers would actually be using this technology will be massively lowered if you use, let's say, non-in situ technology, if you do use remote sensing technology. And I think it's a big advantage, and that's where the industry is heading to.
So if it, let's say, like you said, it may end up costing the farmer like a few $100s or a few €100 per year. I just realized I'm such a city boy, so to say, that I really have no clue about farming. Like, what kind of, like, how much money does that represent in terms of, as, like, if you look at the cost per hectare of your product, how does that compare to sort of like the sort of revenue per hectare? Is it like a tiny percentage? Is it, I don't know, how does it compare?
So we have to be aware that there's someone in between still. If we take companies which are basing their service only on visual imagery, they're usually taking between 25 and 50 euro per hectare per year of area they're looking at. And they're using Sentinel data, or if you go for the higher pricing product, it might be using spot data. And this is only a fraction of the revenue. So if you look, for example, at winter wheat in Spain, and I have to see if the numbers are adding up correctly. You can, if you irrigate the field, you get between 3 and 4 tons of wheat per hectare. This is something which is currently corresponding to something between 600 800 euro per hectare. So if you're spending 50 euro and your revenue is somewhere like, let's say 700, it is a fraction of it, but it's not like a 1%, or it's more like 5 to 10%. However, at the same time, I must say that if you start irrigating a field in Spain, you are increasing the yield by a factor of 6 if you do it correctly. The largest cost factor actually is water. So if you at the same time if you're spending 50 euro for this field to get smart irrigation or to get some precision farming device, you're saving in both ways. You're saving the water, so reduced water consumption, which is one of the major cost drivers. On the other hand, on top of this, you might get more yield. And I think the combination here basically clearly outweighs the cost.
Great. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the technology of your satellite platform. So we've already said that, there's some existing satellites which have, infrared sensors, and I think we mentioned Landsat 8. Now, for memory, those are pretty big satellites. I think they're like several tons. Like, how does your satellite compare in terms of, things like size and capability and so forth?
Yeah. First of all, yes, we're new space, so we're tiny. Whereas Landsat 8, I think that it originally cost $850 million US dollars. If they would rebuild it, would still be around $630 million US dollars. We're about 10% cheaper. No, just kidding. We're about cost-wise, I think we're somewhere less than 1% of those costs per satellite. We don't weigh a ton, but we weigh something like 25 kilograms. However, technology-wise, actually comparable. So the technology we have on board, at least part of the technology we actually need to have on board is comparable. So what we've done at Fraunhofer over the last, so before we spun out from Fraunhofer, what we've done at Fraunhofer for the last 5 years was developing technology which is miniaturizing the approach, so that you can actually fit all this into a lot smaller satellite, so shoebox-sized satellite, so 16 liters, so a bit more than your average tranche of milk if you buy it from the supermarket. Well, this was a bit of engineering effort, I must claim. If you think that you can get comparable performance from such a small satellite compared to a large satellite, it's obviously also no-brainer that for a fraction of the cost of the large satellite, you can then send dozens of these small ones into space and solve the dilemma which you usually have with temporal versus spatial resolution. And that's actually also one of our differentiators, I would claim. I don't know of any other company, and there are quite a lot of competitors there, which can bring that performance on such a small scale.
And is that something you're doing in-house because of that specialized knowledge, or are you outsourcing it, or is it like you built a sensor in-house and outsourcing the bus?
So we're actually trying to outsource as much as possible. The critical way, the methodologies, how to integrate it, and the methodologies, how to treat the data. This is what is critical, and this is definitely in-house, and it will stay in-house. Building a satellite bus, integrating a payload into a satellite bus, let's say, apart from certain, let's call it secret recipes for certain problems, is something which has already been solved a few times. So we don't have the ego to say, okay, this needs to be happening in-house, because what we want to do in the end is we would like to scale quickly. And we don't want to build fabs to build this manufacturing or to increase the manufacturing capability. But we are going to, and we have partnered. Today there was a press release with OHB. OHB is one of our investors. And there was a couple of weeks back, there was another one where we're starting having cooperation contracts, in this case also with OHB, but also other companies, to actually do this manufacturing process for us.
Yeah, and I just realized, that's right, you announced the financing round today as well, and so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Okay, and so how big a Constellar you want to have eventually? What makes sense for you?
This is a question which is, at the moment, still difficult to answer. I can tell you how many satellites we would need for daily coverage or twice daily coverage, but I think in the end, what we need to see is, this is something we need to have a rough idea about, but this is not something where we're fixed. We're not an ESA program, we're not an NASA program, but we have 10 years development time, and then needs to be in orbit for 10 years. But we can constantly adapt and we can scale. And that's one of the big advantages. So currently we are assuming that with 28 satellites, we can go as far as daily for enough capacity to serve the whole globe. We would only need 4 satellites to basically, with a lower capacity, to serve daily to a limited amount on the globe, but anyway on the globe. And in the end, what we'll do is we're going to send up the first batch and we see how the market demand is developing. That's the beauty of it. We can scale it. So if there's more market demand, then we simply double the number of satellites. If there's less market demand, then, we don't double it.
And in terms of, we already talked about spatial resolution, and if I remember correctly, you said it's 50 meters for your satellites. And I guess so the other interesting metric is what people call the swath, sort of like, the width of your field of observation.
So again, since we're in the system design, it's not completely fixed. It is comparable to what Planet has. And I mean, the Planet does.
And so I guess one other related question while you're mentioning Planet, or it could be Spire, it could be some of these other companies. If I remember correctly, infrared is just a sensor technology that's, let's call it, complicated or involved enough that it probably wouldn't make sense for you to ever, or you couldn't really go as a hosted payload on some other platform, right? I guess you really do need your own satellite because you have things like cooling that's required and so forth. Is that correct?
It is quite involved technology, that's right. However, we are going on the International Space Station as a hosted payload on one of the external platforms. To test it out. So for a demonstration mission, it's okay. But the way, since we're also talking about tasking and we need to have control over the satellite where it's looking at, I think a hosted payload approach is difficult, especially considering the relatively harsh prerequisite we need to have with the bus. We are at the let's say, at the limit of what a bus of this size can do. We could go to a larger bus, but I'm not sure if this would then be feasible to have us on this bus for the other operator. Especially if you're looking at telecommunication satellites, they usually like to fly high, whereas we obviously like to fly low for resolution reasons and therefore coverage reasons. So it's difficult. We have seen a couple of potential candidates there, but none have really convinced us to be the partner to go with. So yeah, we probably have to go, or we will go with it with our own fleet.
This test on the platform International Space Station, when is that going to happen? And sort of what is generally your plan? Sort of what are the next steps? And when are you going to have your first on-satellite up there?
Okay, so the general plan is this year there are three things going to happen. First, we have a data platform in development, and this data platform is going to be released. And this should be a first way to basically, that's going to be the platform which will cover or host the temperature data from space with the best potential coverage. And this will be released somewhere towards the mid of the year. Then we have different pilots going on. One of these pilots is an airplane mission with a large German entity, several large German entities involved. And this is more about, as you said before, has there been data before? Can you really nail down those numbers? And it's going to be to help us nail down those numbers. What the actually saving in water is and how much early we can actually see water stress and so on and so forth. And then we're going to have a handover to the team to deliver our payload to the International Space Station. Yeah, so that's, let's say, maybe not this year, but in the next 12 months for sure. And the plan is then that by Q1, Q2 next year, we would have the mission design ready and the system design ready. We would then be ready for implementation. And from then it's about 12 to 18 months to actually get our first batch of satellites into orbit. So I would claim that you can expect data in mid-2023.
Okay, terrific. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is, I know ConstellR has been through a couple of incubator programs. Actually, funnily enough, you are in the Creative Destruction Lab base stream, where I'm a mentor, and we shall see each other again on Zoom tomorrow.
Yes.
For the Creative Destruction Lab session. How has that experience been with incubators in general? Is that something you'd recommend to aspiring entrepreneurs, or how do you feel about it?
Yeah, so for us, it was a big help. So initially we thought, okay, it's a choice. Which accelerator are you going to take? And then you stick with this accelerator and that's it. And then you've learned everything. So far, we've been, I think, through 13 or 14 accelerator programs, and they all have their own value. Some of them focus on space entirely. Some of them focus mainly on the business model. Some of them focus on impact. Some of them are just a network. Some of them make you ready for the next funding round. We're always happy to be accelerated. After being through a couple of accelerators, we could spot which accelerator would be a good match for us. We set up a process where we said, okay, what are our weak points and how can we address those weak points? And do we need external input or just need to work more? And for those we need external input, we then chose appropriate accelerator programs. And there's so many, and a lot of them are so well organized. In particular, I would like to say that there are three accelerator programs which really guided us. The first one was the Fraunhofer accelerator program I had, which is a fantastic opportunity. And it's not only for Fraunhofer teams, but this is something which is really well organized, and we learned quite a lot. Then Seraphim Space Camp was another one. We went to London for 8 weeks in 2019, and it was a fantastic approach. And those guys are really focused on everything which is upstream, downstream. They have fantastic connections. And this was a real game changer for us. Then I must also say ESA BIC is actually really good. It's a light touch one, but the connections you get with ESA, if you can call it an accelerator, this business incubation program, is also something which is extremely valuable. Sorry, I said three, but I actually mean four. CDL is actually another one, which is, let's say, objective space. This is a very worthwhile accelerator program, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Yeah, me too. It's always great fun, and I certainly recommend Creative Destruction Lab to many startups that I come in touch with. I guess Fraunhofer, the Fraunhofer Institute, which is, for people who don't know, that's it's a very prestigious German research institute. That's probably the reason you're based in Freiburg in Southwest Germany, right?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, there are 5 Fraunhofer institutes in Freiburg alone. There are 72 or 74 even. I'm not completely sure. I should know this, but I don't. So I think there are a bit more than 70 institutes in Germany, and they've close to 30,000 engineers and scientists working for them. And it's the largest research organization for applied science, not only in Europe, but I think in the world. And yeah, that's the reason. We all started here. We know each other from Fraunhofer, and at least 2 of the 3 co-founders know each other from Fraunhofer. Let's say it's a very good ecosystem to start, even though there are obviously challenges like in any other ecosystem.
And so you're based in Freiburg, which is sort of like a 250,000 inhabitants very nice university city in southwest Germany. I'm pretty partial because I'm originally from Freiburg. However, I'd also be the first to admit that it's not sort of your traditional, space city or anything like that. I mean, it's basically you have most of the German space startups basically in the Munich area and then some in like a few other areas. How has it been sort of being a little bit in a I don't want to say outside, but like in a different city? How has that been? Like, has it been positive, negative? Do you feel detached from the rest of the community, or does it not matter because right now everything's online anyway? Or I don't know.
Right now, it simply doesn't matter. That's the short of it. Right now, it doesn't matter. It would matter a lot if we would do our own hardware development and if we would do our own manufacturing of the satellites. Then it would matter. Then it would be very important to be close to the hubs in Berlin, close to the hubs in Munich, obviously. But with this kind of decentralized approach we're having right now, especially since nearly everybody's in home office, it actually doesn't matter. And we are as close to Munich as we are to Freiburg, or as close to any other place. We actually co-founded the Space Cooperative Europe in Munich while being in Freiburg. So one of us then went over and signed. But I think that the ecosystem is getting stronger, and it's well, as space should be. It is not really limited by space.
And you all of your team is in Freiburg. And by the way, how big is your team now?
Total 17 people. That's also including those people who work with us from the Fraunhofer side. And we have a full-time equivalent of around 12 at the moment. Just to give you a quick scale. So in August last year, we've been 4, growing quickly.
And growing quickly, and now you guys just got some money through the door. Are you actively hiring at the moment?
I believe for now, in the next months, we have all the people we need to keep the core processes of ConstellR running. However, we are obviously always interested in top talent. We have a little database. As it happens, we like to hire slowly. So if you want to get in touch and you're not super desperate to get a job by the end of the month, please get in touch with us, and we're happy to talk to you.
Great, Max. We're down to the final last questions, which are always the same ones I ask. So the first one is, if you weren't doing Constellar, that company that you almost founded by accident, it seems. But assuming you were still interested in space, is there something else that you would be doing in space?
I mean, maybe it's a bit embarrassing, but I would probably do computer games. Just before I did ConstellR, I found ConstellR. I had a little trade and I programmed the computer game together with my brothers. It was also a space-themed computer game. It was kind of the Worms series, but in space with nice gravitational effects. We sold a couple of thousand of copies, and then ConstellR started, and we stopped it. I would probably doing a mix of research and entertainment.
That sounds terrific, actually. I really hope that people are working on that type of concept. And then I guess sort of semi-related, the next question is, which is always the final question, is, do you like science fiction? And if yes, is there any favorite science fiction? And it can be a book, it can be movies, it could be TV series.
Yes, I do love science fiction. I do love it, but I can't claim there's one favorite book I have, or one favorite movie or a computer game or whatever. There's been so much inspiration in the science fiction series, and I tend to say that I love the ones which are not trying to be completely science-based, because maybe as a physicist I'm always trying to find the gaps there in the logic, and that's kind of destroying it for me. So I like the ones which are maybe having a touch of fantasy, and this touch of fantasy would be, for example, in the direction of. So let's say I would prefer Star Wars over
Star Trek,
Foundation, or Star Trek. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I can see as a physicist, you'd like poking the holes everywhere.
Yeah. It's terrible. I'm really sorry.
Great, Max. It's been a pleasure. Again, congratulations on closing your financing round today, and best of luck for the company going forward. And hopefully we speak soon in the future.
Yeah, soon. Hopefully I've got something to tell you. Raphael, it was a pleasure. Thanks for contacting me.
Thanks.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, Check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.